Subscribe to Storylab for more stories. Now, let's begin this one. Chapter 1 Goes to the Past. Richard Marquez stood in his study, staring at the framed photograph on his desk. Him shaking hands with the director of Central Intelligence 15 years ago, the day he'd been appointed station chief in Moscow. Those were different times, when his biggest worry was decoding Russian intelligence patterns, not helping his 17-year-old daughter Caroline with her college applications. The October evening was crisp in Cedar Falls, a small city in upstate New York where Richard had intentionally chosen to disappear after his retirement from the agency. Here, he was just another suburban dad who worked as a security consultant, a deliberately vague job description that kept curious neighbors satisfied. "Dad, dinner's ready." Caroline's voice echoed from downstairs. At 17, she had inherited her mother Julia's warm smile and his own sharp intelligence. She was everything good in his world, the reason he'd walked away from a life of shadows and secrets. Richard closed his laptop, where he'd been reviewing a routine corporate security assessment for a local manufacturing company. It was mundane work compared to his past, but it paid well and kept his skills sharp without the constant threat of assassination or international incidents. The Marquez family dinner table was a sanctuary of normalcy. Julia, a high school English teacher with kind eyes and graying auburn hair, served her famous pot roast while Caroline chattered about her debate team's upcoming tournament. "We're arguing the merits of diplomatic sanctions versus military intervention," Caroline explained, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "I'm taking the diplomatic side, obviously. Dad always says violence should be the last resort." Richard smiled, though he noticed Julia's slight frown. His wife knew enough about his past to understand that violence had rarely been his last resort. It had often been his first, second, and third options. But that was the old Richard, the one who'd earned the nickname Moscow Shadow for his ability to eliminate threats before they knew he existed. "That's right, sweetheart," he said, cutting his meat with precision. "Smart people find smart solutions." The peaceful evening shattered when Caroline's phone buzzed insistently. She glanced at it and her face went pale. "What is it?" Julia asked. Caroline's hands trembled as she showed them the screen. It was a series of increasingly aggressive text messages from an unknown number. "Hey, beautiful. Saw you at school today. Love that tight sweater you wore. Don't ignore me when I'm talking to you. You stuck-up bitch. You think you're too good for me? I know where you live. 47 Maple Street. Nice house." The last message had been sent just minutes ago. Richard's demeanor shifted so subtly that only Julia noticed, the slight straightening of his shoulders, the way his eyes went cold and calculating. The family man was still there, but something much more dangerous had awakened beneath the surface. "Block the number," he said calmly. "Then show me your phone." As Caroline handed over her device, Richard's trained eye quickly assessed the situation. The messages showed escalating aggression, intimate knowledge of Caroline's daily routine, and the final boundary crossing of revealing their home address. This wasn't random teenage harassment. This was predatory behavior. "Do you recognize this number?" he asked. Caroline shook her head. "I've never seen it before, but—" She hesitated. "But what?" "There's this guy at school, Drew Black. He's been weird around me lately, following me between classes, trying to sit near me at lunch. When I told him I wasn't interested, he got really angry." Julia reached across the table to squeeze Caroline's hand. "We should call the police." Richard was already moving, walking to the kitchen window to scan their quiet neighborhood street. Everything appeared normal, but his instincts were screaming warnings. In Moscow, he learned that the most dangerous enemies were the ones who felt entitled to take whatever they wanted. "We will," he said, returning to the table. "But first, tell me everything you know about this Drew Black." Caroline took a shaky breath. "He's a senior. I'm a junior. He drives this expensive black Camaro that he's always revving in the parking lot. The teachers never discipline him, and other kids seem afraid of him, I guess. Like he's untouchable. What does his family do?" "I don't know exactly, but they have money. Lots of it. He's always bragging about his uncle's business empire or whatever." Richard felt a familiar chill run down his spine. In his experience, Teenagers who felt untouchable usually had a reason, and families with mysterious business empires that made teachers and students afraid often had connections to organized crime. "I'm calling the school first thing tomorrow," Julius said. "This is harassment." "Actually," Richard said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone his family rarely heard, "let me handle this. I'll pay a visit to the school and have a conversation with the administration. Then we'll see what kind of family produces a young man who thinks he can threaten my daughter." That night, after Julia and Caroline had gone to bed, Richard sat in his study making phone calls. His first was to Detective Frank Kowalski, a Cedar Falls cop who'd helped him with minor security issues over the years. "Frank, it's Richard Marquez. I need a favor." "Yes, I know it's late. I need you to run a name for me." Drew Black, teenage male, probably 17 or 18, drives a black Camaro. "What? Are you sure?" Richard's blood went cold as Frank explained that Drew Black was the nephew of Salvador Black, the most powerful organized crime figure in the tri-state area. The Black family had moved into Cedar Falls 3 years ago, buying up legitimate businesses as fronts while running illegal operations throughout upstate New York. "Frank, this kid has been harassing my daughter. Sent threatening messages to her phone tonight, including our home address." There was a long pause. "Richard, I'm going to give you some advice as a friend. Salvador Black isn't someone you want to cross. He's not just connected, he is the connection. The state police have been trying to build a case against him for years, but witnesses have a habit of disappearing or suddenly remembering things differently." "What are you telling me, Frank?" "I'm telling you that if Salvador Black's nephew wants something in this town, he usually gets it. And if someone stands in his way." Frank's voice trailed off. After hanging up, Richard sat in the darkness of his study, staring at his old service weapon locked in the desk drawer. For 15 years, he'd been Richard Marquez, suburban dad and security consultant. But Drew Black had made a critical error in judgment. He'd threatened the wrong man's daughter. And Salvador Black was about to discover that some ghost from the past never truly rest. Chapter 2. Lines in the Sand. The next morning, Richard dropped Caroline off at Cedar Falls High School personally, scanning the parking lot for the black Camaro. It was there, gleaming in the October sunlight, parked diagonally across 2 spaces, a small but telling display of arrogance. "Dad, you don't have to walk me in," Caroline protested as Richard got out of his SUV. "Yes, I do." Principal Margaret Hayes was a nervous woman in her 50s who'd held her position for 8 years by avoiding conflicts with powerful families. When Richard entered her office, she immediately recognized the type of controlled intensity he projected. "Mr. Marquez, please sit down. I understand there's been some communication between your daughter and another student." "There's been harassment," Richard corrected, placing printouts of the text messages on her desk. "Escalating threats from Drew Black. What's the school's policy on this behavior?" Principal Hayes barely glanced at the messages before sliding them back toward him. "Mr. Marquez, I'm sure this is just typical teenage drama. Boys will be boys, you know." Perhaps Caroline misinterpreted. "My daughter didn't misinterpret anything." Richard's voice dropped to the tone he'd once used in interrogation rooms in Langley. "This young man knows our home address. He's making sexual comments and implicit threats. What are you going to do about it?" "Well, I could speak with Drew, of course, but without any actual evidence of misconduct on school property. The messages are evidence. Text messages sent off campus don't fall under our jurisdiction." Principal Hayes was clearly uncomfortable, but standing her ground. "Perhaps you should speak with Drew's family directly. The Blacks are very reasonable people. I'm sure this can all be resolved amicably." Richard studied the principal's face and recognized the telltale signs of someone operating under pressure. Her quick dismissal, the way she avoided eye contact when mentioning the Black family, the subtle tremor in her voice. She was terrified of them. "How long have the Blacks been major donors to this school?" he asked quietly. Principal Hayes's face went white. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I'm asking a direct question." "This meeting is over, Mr. Marquez. If you have concerns about student behavior, you're free to contact the police." As Richard left the school, he noticed Drew Black leaning against his Camaro, surrounded by a small group of other students who looked more like an entourage than friends. Drew was tall for his age, with dark hair and the kind of cocky smirk that suggested he'd never faced real consequences for his actions. Their eyes met across the parking lot. Drew said something to his friends that made them laugh, then deliberately pulled out his phone and began typing, never breaking eye contact with Richard. Caroline's phone buzzed 30 seconds later. The message was simple: "Daddy can't protect you forever." That evening, Richard was grilling chicken in the backyard when his phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown local number. Marquez. "Mr. Marquez, this is Salvador Black." The voice was smooth, cultured, with just a hint of an accent that suggested old-world roots. "I understand there's been some confusion involving our children." Richard set down his grilling tools and walked to the far corner of his yard, away from the kitchen window, where Julia was preparing sides for dinner. "No confusion on my end, Mr. Black. Your nephew has been harassing my daughter. It needs to stop. Drew is a passionate young man, Mr. Marquez. Sometimes that passion gets misdirected, but I'm sure we can work something out between reasonable fathers. Simple solution: your nephew leaves my daughter alone. Completely. No contact, no messages, no following her around school. In return, I won't press charges." Salvador Black's laugh was warm, but somehow menacing. "Mr. Marquez, I think you misunderstand how things work in this town. My family has invested heavily in this community. We employ hundreds of people, support local businesses, contribute to schools and charities. We are the law in this town. My advice? Let young people work out their own relationships. Do nothing more about this situation, or you'll pay with your life." Richard felt the familiar calm that had always come over him in moments of extreme danger. His voice became deadly quiet. "Mr. Black, I was CIA station chief in Moscow for 6 years. I've dealt with the Russian Bratva, Chechen separatists, and GRU assassins. I've turned oligarchs, eliminated double agents, and prevented 3 different attempts to restart the Cold War." His tone was conversational, almost pleasant. "Give me your nephew in 30 minutes, delivered to my house with a written apology, or you won't get second chance." The line went silent for several heartbeats. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Marquez." "No, Mr. Black. You made the mistake when you let your nephew threaten my family." Salvador Black hung up. Richard checked his watch and went back to the grill. Julia came outside with a platter for the chicken. "Who was on the phone?" she asked. "Wrong number." Richard lied smoothly, though something in his expression made Julia step closer. "Richard, what's going on? You've been different since last night." "Tenser." Before he could answer, his phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed G. Black. "Marquez." The voice on the other end was breathless, panicked. "Dear God, what monster are you?" Richard recognized the voice of a man on the edge of terror. "I'm sorry, who is this?" "This is Jerry Black, Salvador's consigliere. Do you have any idea what you've done? Who you've threatened?" "I threatened a man whose nephew is harassing my daughter. Nothing more, nothing less." "We looked you up." Jerry's voice cracked. "Jesus Christ, we looked you up. The Moscow Ghost. The Bratva Killer. The man who walked into that warehouse in St. Petersburg and came out alone while 12 Russians stayed behind his corpses." Richard felt a cold smile touch his lips. His reputation from the old days was apparently intact. "Then you understand that I don't make threats I can't keep," he said calmly. 28 minutes now, Mr. Black. Please, we can work something out. Drew's just a kid. 27 minutes. The line went dead. Julia was staring at him now, the platter forgotten in her hands. "Richard, who are you talking to? What monster? What warehouse?" Richard looked at his wife, seeing the concern and growing fear in her eyes. For 15 years, he'd protected her and Caroline from his past. But now that past was colliding with his present, and there was no avoiding it. "Julia, I need you to take Caroline to your sister's house in Albany. Tonight." "What? Why?" "Richard, you're scaring me. Because some very dangerous people are about to learn that threatening my family was the worst mistake they'll ever make," he said quietly. "And I don't want you or Caroline anywhere near what happens next." As if summoned by his words, the sound of multiple car engines grew louder on their quiet residential street. Richard looked over the fence and saw 3 black SUVs pulling up in front of their house. The game had begun, and Salvador Black was about to discover that the Moscow Shadow had never truly retired. He'd simply been waiting for the right reason to emerge from the darkness. Chapter 3: The Awakening. Richard moved with practiced efficiency, his 15 years of suburban quiet falling away like a discarded mask. While Julia hurried upstairs to pack emergency bags, he retrieved his go-bag from the hidden compartment in his study, a habit from his agency days that he'd never abandoned. The bag contained items that would have alarmed his neighbors. Multiple fake IDs, encrypted satellite phone, $50,000 in untraceable cash, and most importantly, contact information for assets he'd cultivated during his operational years. Some debts from the intelligence world never expired. "Caroline, come downstairs now," he called calmly, watching through the window as men in expensive suits positioned themselves around his property. They were trying to look casual, but Richard could identify their weapon placement and exit strategies from decades of experience. "Dad, there are men outside," Caroline whispered, her face pale as she came down the stairs with a hastily packed backpack. "I know. Your mother is taking you to Aunt Sarah's house. You'll be safe there." Julia appeared, her teacher's training allowing her to maintain calm in a crisis, even as her hand shook slightly. "Richard, what is this? Who are those people?" "The Black family," making a statement. Richard handed Julia a burner phone. "Speed dial 1 reaches a federal marshal named Tom Murphy. If anything happens to me, call him immediately and tell him Moscow Shadow needs extraction. He'll understand." "Moscow Shadow?" Julia's eyes widened. "Richard, what did you do in Russia?" Richard cupped his wife's face in his hands, looking into her eyes with all the love and regret of 15 years of half-truths. "I did things that kept America safe, but cost me pieces of my soul. I retired because I wanted to be a better man for you and Caroline. But those men outside have threatened our daughter, and they've awakened something I hoped would stay buried forever." The doorbell rang. "Go out the back door," Richard instructed. "My SUV is in the garage. Drive to Sarah's and don't look back." Julia grabbed Caroline's hand, but hesitated. "What about you?" "I'm going to remind some people why certain lines should never be crossed." Richard waited until he heard his garage door open and his SUV pull out of the driveway before answering the front door. Two large men in dark suits flanked a smaller, well-dressed man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and cold blue eyes. "Mr. Marquez, I'm Salvador Black. These are my associates, Maurice Floyd and Billy Neal. I believe we had a phone conversation earlier." "We did. You're 4 minutes late with your nephew's apology." Salvador's eyes narrowed. "I came to offer you one last chance to be reasonable. My nephew is young, impulsive. Boys chase girls, it's natural. But you've escalated this situation unnecessarily. Your nephew threatened my daughter and our home. That's not boys chasing girls. That's predatory behavior." Maurice Floyd, a mountain of a man with scarred knuckles, took a step closer. "Maybe you didn't understand Mr. Black the first time." Richard didn't move, but something in his stillness made both enforcers hesitate. "I understood perfectly. Your boss threatened my life if I didn't let his nephew harass my daughter. That was his first mistake. His second mistake was not researching who he was threatening." "We researched you plenty," Salvador said with confidence. Richard Marquez, 48 years old, security consultant, married to Julia Gallagher Marquez, one daughter. Clean record, pays taxes, coaches Little League. Very suburban, very ordinary. "That's Richard Marquez, the civilian," Richard replied softly. But Drew didn't threaten Richard Marquez, the civilian. He threatened the daughter of Richard Marquez, former CIA Station Chief Moscow, specialized in counterintelligence and elimination of high-value targets. And that man operates by very different rules. Salvador's confidence flickered for just a moment. "Former CIA agents don't scare me, Marquez. I've dealt with feds before. Not like me, you haven't." Richard's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and smiled coldly. "Gentlemen, while we've been talking, some old friends of mine have been busy. Maurice Floyd, you have 3 outstanding warrants in Atlantic City for assault and battery. Billy Neal, the FBI has been looking for you in connection with those armored car robberies in Buffalo, They have your fingerprints from the third job. Both men's faces went white. Salvador's eyes hardened. You're bluffing. Richard's smile widened. Am I? Billy, check your phone. You should have a text from your girlfriend Allison Gonzalez about now. Billy fumbled for his phone, his face draining of color as he read the message. Boss, they got Allison. Someone's asking her questions about Buffalo. And Maurice, your bookmaker Russ Mayo, is currently explaining to some very interested federal agents how you've been placing bets with money from the Black family's protection racket. Maurice looked at Salvador with growing panic. How the fuck does he know about Russ? Because, Richard said, stepping back into his house, I spent 6 years in Moscow turning Russian gangsters against each other. You think a small-time crime family in upstate New York is more challenging than the Bratva? Salvador's composure cracked. What do you want? Simple. Drew writes a formal apology to my daughter, delivered by you, in person, within the hour. He transfers to a different school, I don't care where. Your family ceases all operations in Cedar Falls and relocates your business interests to a different city. Do this, and your associate's legal problems disappear. You can't make those charges disappear. No, but the people who can are currently waiting for my phone call. Salvador, you run a small regional operation. I maintained assets inside the GRU, FSB, and Bratva simultaneously. We're not playing in the same league. Richard's phone rang. He answered it without taking his eyes off Salvador. Yes. Confirmed. Excellent. He hung up and turned back to the three men. That was confirmation that your nephew Drew has been expelled from school as of 5 minutes ago for possession of narcotics with intent to distribute. Apparently, a concerned citizen called in a tip about his locker. You planted drugs on my nephew. Salvador's voice rose. I didn't plan anything, but I did arrange for someone to look more carefully at what was already there. Drew's been dealing cocaine to his classmates for months. The surveillance footage from the school parking lot is quite clear. Salvador Black's face had gone from confident to furious to something approaching respect. You did all this in one afternoon? Salvador, I could have killed all three of you in the time it took to have this conversation. Instead, I'm offering you a way out. Take it. The crime boss studied Richard's face for a long moment, seeing something there that made him reconsider everything he thought he knew about suburban security consultants. 1 hour, Salvador said finally. Then we discussed terms for relocating our operations. No discussion needed. Be gone by the end of the week, or I'll activate every federal contact I've maintained since retirement. The Moscow Shadow kept detailed records of everything, Salvador. And some of those files might be very interesting to the right prosecutors. As the three men left, Richard closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the familiar exhaustion that followed operational stress. He pulled out his secure phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in 5 years. Murphy here. Tom, it's Richard. I'm calling in every favor you owe me. Jesus, Richard. We heard you'd gone completely civilian. What's the situation? Local organized crime family threatened my daughter. I've neutralized the immediate threat, but I need cleanup and relocation assistance for the Black family's criminal enterprise. How immediate is immediate? Richard checked his watch. Drew Black should be arriving with a written apology in 45 minutes. His uncle has until the end of the week to relocate his entire operation out of my city. Tom Murphy's laughter carried genuine admiration. Still the same Moscow Shadow. Some people never change. This time it's personal, Tom, and I'm done pretending to be someone I'm not. As Richard waited for Drew Black's humiliating apology, he felt a transformation that had been building for 15 years finally complete itself. He tried to be a suburban dad, but some men were forged in darker fires. Salvador Black had awakened something that should have stayed sleeping. Now he would learn the true cost of threatening the Moscow Shadow's family. Chapter 4, Chessmaster. Drew Black arrived at Richard's door 47 minutes later, accompanied by Salvador and looking like he'd been crying. The 18-year-old's arrogance had evaporated, replaced by the hollow-eyed shock of someone whose world had just collapsed. Mr. Marquez, Drew's voice cracked as he held out a handwritten letter. I want to apologize for my behavior toward Caroline. It was inappropriate and threatening, and I'm deeply sorry. Richard read the letter carefully, noting the formal language that had clearly been dictated by Salvador's lawyers. This acknowledges harassment and threatening behavior toward a minor, Drew. Are you sure you want to sign it? Drew looked at his uncle, who nodded grimly. Yes, sir. Good. Now delete Caroline's phone number from your contacts. Block her on all social media. And understand that if you ever approach her, speak to her, or even look in her direction again, what happened today will seem like a gentle warning. After Drew and Salvador left, Richard called Julia. It's safe to come home. The immediate threat has been handled. Richard, I've been thinking about what you said earlier. About Moscow. About what you did there. Julia's voice was strained. I need to know who I married. When you get home, I'll tell you everything. That evening, after Caroline had gone to her room to video chat with friends about the day's dramatic events, Richard sat with Julia in their living room and did something he'd never done before. He told her the complete truth about his operational years. The CIA recruited me from Army Special Forces when I was 26, he began. I had a talent for languages and what they called adaptive personality integration, the ability to become someone else completely. After 3 years at Langley, they posted me to Moscow as a deep cover operative. Julia listened without interruption as Richard described a world she'd never imagined, of turned Russian agents, assassination attempts, and a shadow war fought in the streets of post-Soviet Moscow. They called me the Moscow Shadow because I could eliminate targets without leaving traces. Not just killing. Julia, that was crude. I specialized in making people disappear so completely that even their own organizations assumed they defected or fled. I turned organized crime bosses against each other, fed information to rival intelligence services, and systematically dismantled networks that threatened American interests. How many people did you kill? Julia asked quietly. Richard met her eyes steadily. 43 confirmed eliminations over 6 years, all authorized by the agency, all threats to national security or American operatives. Julia was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller. When you retired and we moved here, I thought you were done with all that. I was. I wanted to be a father and husband, not an operator. But today, when that man threatened Caroline, Richard's voice hardened. I realized some parts of who you are never change. They just go dormant until they're needed. What happens now? Salvador Black relocates his operation, Drew transfers schools, and our family goes back to normal. Except now, everyone knows that crossing the Marquez family has consequences. But Richard was underestimating Salvador Black's pride and connections. The next morning, Richard was reviewing security assessments when his encrypted phone buzzed with an emergency signal. Tom Murphy's voice was tense. Richard, we have a problem. Salvador Black has connections we didn't anticipate. His organization isn't just regional. They're front for the Torino family out of New York City. And the Torinos have federal protection through a joint task force operation. Richard felt ice forming in his stomach. What kind of protection? The kind where certain prosecutors look the other way in exchange for information about Russian organized crime activities. Salvador Black is a registered CI, confidential informant. Since when? 3 years, right around the time he moved to Cedar Falls. Richard processed this information with growing anger. Salvador Black wasn't just a local crime boss. He was a federal asset who'd been operating under government protection while his nephew terrorized local teenagers. Tom, who's his handler? FBI Special Agent Alex Boyle, Organized Crime Task Force. Richard, this complicates things significantly. If Black makes a complaint about federal harassment, he won't. How can you be sure? Richard smiled coldly. Because I'm about to give him much bigger problems to worry about. That afternoon, Richard made a series of phone calls to contacts he'd maintained since retirement. His first call was to Dmitry Volkov, a former Bratva lieutenant who'd been one of his assets in Moscow and was now running legitimate businesses in Brooklyn. Richard, my friend, it's good to hear your voice. You need favor. I need information, Dmitry. Salvador Black operates out of Cedar Falls, New York. He's supposedly connected to the Torino family. Ah, yes. Small fish who thinks he is shark. He pays tribute to Torinos, but is not true member. More like, how you say, franchisee. I need his business operations mapped. Every front company, every revenue stream, every connection that matters. This costs money, Richard. Bill it to our old accounts. Tom Murphy will authorize payment. For Moscow Shadow, this I do gladly. Black family thinks they are untouchable because they whisper in FBI ears, but they do not understand true power structure. Richard's second call was to Elena Vasquez, a former NSA analyst who now worked as a private intelligence consultant. Richard Marquez, as I live and breathe. I heard you gone completely suburban. Suburban dad whose daughter was threatened. I need electronic surveillance on the Black family's communications. Everything, phones, computers, family members, associates. That's asking a lot for a personal grudge match. Elena, remember Budapest? When the Russians had you marked for elimination and I extracted you through 3 countries while carrying you on my back with a bullet wound. Shit, you're calling in the big one. I'm calling in every favor I'm owed. By evening, Richard had activated a network of assets and contacts that spanned from Brooklyn to Moscow. Federal protection or not, Salvador Black was about to learn that some enemies couldn't be handled through traditional channels. His phone rang at 9 p.m. Salvador's voice was tight with anger. You don't know when to quit, do you, Marquez? I haven't started yet, Salvador. Drew's expulsion and your nephew's humiliation? That was me being reasonable. I'm a federal informant. You son of a bitch. You can't touch me. Richard's laugh was genuinely amused. You think informant status protects you? Salvador, I've turned federal informants against their handlers, handlers against their agencies, and agencies against each other. Your FBI protection is worth exactly as much as I decide it's worth. The Torino family won't stand for. The Torino family is about to discover that their Cedar Falls operation has been skimming money, conducting unauthorized narcotics distribution, and most interestingly, sharing information with Russian organized crime figures about federal investigation techniques. The line went silent. That's impossible, Salvador said finally. Is it? Check your nephew Drew's phone records from the last 6 months. Very interesting calls to some Brighton Beach numbers. The FBI is going to be fascinated by those connections. Richard was lying about the phone records, but Salvador's sharp intake of breath suggested he'd hit a nerve. In his experience, guilty men always assumed their darkest secrets had been discovered. You're bluffing. Tomorrow morning, the FBI task force will receive an anonymous package containing financial records showing systematic skimming from Torino operations, evidence of unauthorized drug distribution by Black family members, and most damaging of all, recordings of conversations between Drew Black and known Russian operatives discussing federal investigation methods. There are no such recordings, aren't there, Salvador? In the age of electronic surveillance, are you absolutely certain your nephew hasn't said anything compromising to the wrong people? Teenagers are notoriously bad at operational security. Richard could hear Salvador's breathing becoming labored. The crime boss was realizing that whether the evidence was real or manufactured, its existence would be enough to end his federal protection and make him a liability to the Torino family. What do you want? Salvador asked finally. What I wanted from the beginning. Your family relocates. Completely. Not just Cedar Falls. Out of New York State entirely. You have 72 hours. That's impossible. I can't just. Salvador, let me explain something about the intelligence world. When an asset becomes a liability, they get burned. When a burned asset becomes a threat to operational security, they get eliminated. You're about to become both. Richard hung up and smiled. The game was accelerating exactly as he'd planned. But Salvador Black had one more card to play, and it would force Richard to reveal just how far he was willing to go to protect his family. Chapter 5. The Torino Problem. At 3:47 a.m., Richard's security system triggered. Motion detectors activated around his property perimeter, followed immediately by the sound of glass breaking in his kitchen. He was already moving, having anticipated this escalation. Richard slipped out of bed without waking Julia and retrieved his Glock 19 from the bedside safe. The house had been modified during his early retirement with defensive features that appeared cosmetic to visitors but provided tactical advantages. Reinforced doors, bulletproof glass and key windows, and sight lines designed for defensive positioning. 3 figures moved through his backyard with professional precision. Not Salvador's usual heavies. These men moved like operators. Richard recognized military training in their approach patterns and weapon discipline. His secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message. Torino cleanup crew. Black is burned. Family orders. Eliminate witness and liability. Tom Murphy had come through with intelligence, but too late to prevent the incursion. Richard activated the house's panic room protocol. Steel shutters dropped over windows. Reinforced doors locked automatically, and the master bedroom became a hardened defensive position. Julia woke to the sound of mechanical systems engaging. Richard? What's happening? Stay low and get to Caroline's room. Move quickly but quietly. Julia didn't argue. 15 years of marriage to a former operator had taught her to trust his judgment in crisis situations. Richard's phone rang. Salvador's voice was strained, desperate. Marquez, call off your dogs. The Torinos think I've been compromised by your federal contacts. They've ordered cleanup. My federal contacts? Richard had to admire the irony. Salvador, you played yourself. The moment you became more liability than asset, your protection evaporated. I can fix this. I can make them understand it was a misunderstanding. No, you can't. Because there was no misunderstanding. You threatened my daughter, I responded proportionally, and now your bosses have decided you're a security risk. That's not my problem. Through his reinforced window, Richard watched the 3-man team position themselves for a coordinated entry. Professional spacing, suppressed weapons, tactical gear. These weren't street enforcers. They were ex-military contractors. Please, my nephew is just 18 years old. He made a mistake. Your nephew sexually harassed a minor and made specific threats against my family. The consequences for that decision are now unfolding according to the rules your organization established, not mine. Richard heard the subtle sound of lock picks on his front door. Time for conversation was over. Salvador, I'm about to defend my home against your cleanup crew. If you want your nephew to live through the night, I suggest you call off your dogs immediately. I can't. The order came from New York. Richard hung up and took position in the upstairs hallway, where architectural sightlines gave him overlapping fields of fire on both the staircase and the second-floor landing. The panic room protocol had sealed Julia and Caroline in the master bedroom behind 6 inches of steel and Kevlar. The front door opened silently. These operators were skilled. Richard's phone buzzed with another encrypted message. Local PD compromised. Response delayed 20 minutes minimum. So Salvador had bought time by ensuring police response would be slow. This was now a purely kinetic situation. The first operator appeared at the base of the staircase, using a tactical mirror to clear corners. Richard waited, controlling his breathing, feeling the familiar calm that came with operational focus. 15 years of suburban life hadn't dulled his reflexes. When the man committed to the staircase, Richard fired twice, center mass, followed by a headshot. The suppressed .40 caliber rounds were devastating at close range. The operator dropped without a sound. The second and third operators immediately adapted, one moving to flank through the kitchen while the other provided covering fire up the stairs. These men were experienced professionals who'd worked together before. Richard smiled grimly. Professional operators followed predictable patterns, and he'd spent years learning to exploit those patterns. He triggered the house's secondary defensive system, high-intensity strobes and acoustic disruptors that turned the first floor into a sensory nightmare. Then he moved to the second flanking position, using the house's architecture to maintain tactical advantage. The kitchen operator stumbled in the disorienting lights and sound, giving Richard a clear shot through the banister spindles. 2 more suppressed rounds ended that threat. The third operator had combat experience and didn't panic. He retreated to the living room and set up a defensive position, obviously planning to wait out the strobes and force Richard to come to him. Richard's phone rang again. Salvador's voice was panicked. Jesus Christ, what's happening? My men aren't responding. Your men are dead, Salvador. 2 down, 1 remaining. He's currently trapped in my living room wondering how a suburban security consultant turned his professional cleanup into a massacre. This is insane. You can't just kill federal contractors. Federal contractors? Richard laughed coldly. Salvador, those men came to murder my family in our sleep. Their employment status is irrelevant. Through the acoustic chaos, Richard heard the remaining operator speaking into a throat mic, calling for extraction or backup. Tom in this. Richard triggered the house's fire suppression system, flooding the first floor with halon gas that would incapacitate without permanent damage. Then he moved to the staircase and waited. The third operator stumbled out of the living room, disoriented by gas and strobes. Richard's final 2 rounds were surgical, shoulder and thigh, designed to incapacitate without killing. Silence returned to the Marquez house. Richard zip-tied the wounded operator, then called Tom Murphy. Tom, it's Richard. I need immediate federal cleanup at my location. 3-man team, 2 Kia, 1 wounded and ready for interrogation. And Tom, run background on these operators. I want to know who's really pulling strings in the Torino organization. Jesus, Richard, are Julia and Caroline safe? But this just became bigger than a local crime family. Someone with serious resources wanted my family eliminated. Richard checked on his wife and daughter, who were shaken but unhurt, then returned to his wounded prisoner. Federal contractor, special forces background, probably PMC work overseas, Richard assessed professionally. Who sent you? The man glared defiantly. Go fuck yourself. Wrong answer. Richard applied pressure to the shoulder wound with clinical precision. The operator's defiance cracked. Jesus. Stop. It was a standard contract. Eliminate liability and witnesses. Who authorized the contract? I don't know. We got it through Torino channels, but the money came from somewhere else. Richard increased pressure. Where else? Offshore accounts. Clean money, professional grade. This wasn't some mob hit. Someone with serious juice wanted you gone. Richard's blood went cold. Someone had used Salvador Black's federal informant status and Drew's harassment as cover to eliminate him. This wasn't about his daughter at all. Someone knew who the Moscow Shadow really was, and they wanted him permanently retired. The game had just become infinitely more dangerous. Chapter 6, Shadows and Revelations. Tom Murphy arrived 40 minutes later with a federal cleanup crew that moved with impressive efficiency. The 2 dead operators were bagged and removed, while paramedics treated the wounded contractor, who was then transferred to a secure medical facility for enhanced interrogation. Richard, this is way beyond what we discussed, Tom said as they stood in Richard's kitchen, surveying the damage. Professional military contractors, offshore funding, and someone with enough juice to delay police response? You've kicked over a bigger rock than we realized. I need the wounded operator's full background and financial records. Someone hired him specifically to eliminate me, not my family. We were just collateral damage. What makes you so sure? Richard gestured at the tactical precision of the attack. 3 ex-special forces contractors with high-end equipment and perfect intelligence on my security systems? That's not mob cleanup, Tom. That's targeted elimination by someone who knows exactly who I am. Julia appeared in the kitchen doorway, wrapped in a robe and looking shaken. Richard, Caroline's asking questions I don't know how to answer. She heard the gunshots. Tell her the truth. Bad people tried to hurt our family, and I stopped them. She's old enough to understand that sometimes violence is necessary to protect the people you love. Tom's phone buzzed with an encrypted message. His face darkened as he read it. Richard, we've got a problem. The wounded contractor's real name is Luke Robertson. He's not ex-military. He's currently active CIA, assigned to the Special Activities Division. Richard felt the floor shift beneath him. Active CIA? Try to kill me? That's impossible. Gets worse. His handler is someone you know, Frederick Cohen. The name hit Richard like a physical blow. Frederick Cohen had been his deputy station chief in Moscow, the man he'd trusted with his life for 3 years. More importantly, Cohen was one of only 5 people who knew about Richard's most classified operation in Russia, the elimination of Viktor Petrov. Tom, I need secure comms with Langley. Director level, immediate. Richard, what aren't you telling me? Richard stared out his shattered kitchen window, memories of Moscow flooding back. There was an operation in my final year as station chief. Something went wrong, and I had to make a decision that saved American lives, but violated several international treaties. The details were classified above my pay grade, but Cohen was there. What kind of decision? The kind that could start a war if it ever came to light. 2 hours later, Richard sat in the secure communications room at the Albany FBI field office, speaking directly with CIA Director Patricia Hayes via encrypted video link. Director Hayes, I'm requesting a full review of personnel files for Frederick Cohen, current assignment and operational status. Mr. Marquez, your operational clearance was revoked upon retirement. I can't authorize. Then I'll make this simple, Richard interrupted. Someone used my daughter's harassment as cover to eliminate me using active CIA personnel. Either Cohen has gone rogue, or there's a sanctioned operation to clean up loose ends from my Moscow assignment. Either way, my family is in immediate danger. Director Hayes leaned forward on the screen. What makes you think this involves Cohen? Because Luke Robertson was his asset, and only 5 people know about the Petrov operation. If someone's cleaning house, they're working from a very specific list. The director's expression grew grave. Richard Frederick Cohen died 6 months ago in a car accident outside Vienna. Richard felt ice forming in his veins. That's impossible. Tom Murphy's intelligence says Cohen is Robertson's handler. Then someone is using Cohen's identity and clearances. Richard, if what you're suggesting is accurate, we have a penetration at the highest levels of the agency. Director, I need the names and current locations of everyone who had knowledge of the Petrov operation. That information is classified. Ma'am, with respect, someone is systematically eliminating people with knowledge of that operation. If I'm right, the other 3 targets are already dead or marked for termination. Director Hayes consulted something off-screen, her face growing increasingly grim. Jesus Christ, she whispered. David Park, former Moscow communications officer, died in a hiking accident in Oregon 3 weeks ago. Michael Torres, former deputy analyst, apparent suicide in Miami 5 days ago. That leaves me and whoever authorized the original operation, Richard said grimly. Who gave the order to eliminate Petrov? Richard, that authorization came from the highest levels of government. I can't. Ma'am, if I don't know who authorized Petrov's elimination, I can't protect them. And if they die, I become the only living person who knows what really happened in that Moscow warehouse. The director was quiet for a long moment. The authorization came from Senator Howard Cruz, then chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. He's now running for president. Everything clicked into place for Richard. Howard Cruz was the frontrunner for the Republican presidential nomination. His campaign built on a platform of aggressive foreign policy and eliminating threats to American security. If his role in an unauthorized assassination in Russia became public, ma'am, someone is cleaning up loose ends to protect Cruz's presidential campaign. They've eliminated everyone with operational knowledge except me. Richard, this is speculation. No, ma'am, this is counterintelligence. Someone with access to CIA personnel files and operational histories is systematically eliminating witnesses. They used my daughter's harassment as operational cover to make my death look like unrelated criminal activity. Richard's secure phone buzzed with an emergency message from Julia. Men watching the house. Caroline scared. Director, I need immediate protection for my family. If I'm right, the cleanup team will try again. I'm authorizing a protection detail immediately. Richard, if your theory is correct, we're dealing with a penetration that goes to the very top of the intelligence community. Then we better figure out who's pulling the strings before they eliminate the last witness. As Richard ended the call, he realized the true scope of what he was facing. This wasn't about his daughter's harassment or Salvador Black's wounded pride. Someone was willing to kill multiple people to protect Howard Cruz's presidential ambitions. And Richard Marquez was the final name on their list. The Moscow Shadow was about to face his most dangerous enemy yet, someone inside America's own intelligence apparatus who knew all his strengths, all his weaknesses, and all his secrets. The game had just become a matter of national security. Chapter 7. The Senator's Secret. Richard returned home to find his street crawling with federal agents in unmarked cars. Tom Murphy had set up a command post in Richard's garage, complete with communications equipment and tactical displays showing positions of protection assets. Julia and Caroline are secure, Tom reported. Full protection detail. Safe house prepared if necessary. But Richard, we've got new intelligence that changes everything. Tom handed him a classified file folder. Luke Robertson's financial records. He's been receiving payments from a shell company called Blackwater Holdings, registered in the Cayman Islands, funded through a series of offshore accounts that trace back to political action committees supporting Howard Cruz's presidential campaign. Richard scanned the documents, his operational mind processing the implications. Someone in Cruz's campaign is using PAC money to fund assassination contracts. Gets worse. We ran forensic accounting on the other victims. David Park and Michael Torres both received threatening messages in the weeks before their deaths. Messages that referenced their families being harmed if they didn't maintain operational security. They were being silenced. And when threats didn't work, they were eliminated. Richard, you're the last loose end. Richard's secure phone rang. The caller ID showed unknown. Marquez. Mr. Marquez, this is Senator Howard Cruz. I understand there have been some complications regarding your retirement. Richard felt his pulse quicken. The target was making direct contact, either supremely confident or desperate. Senator, I wasn't aware we'd ever met. We haven't, but your reputation precedes you. The Moscow Shadow, eliminator of threats to American interests. I wanted to speak with you directly about our mutual interest in maintaining national security. And what interest might that be? The Petrov operation, Mr. Marquez. A necessary action that eliminated a significant threat to American assets in Russia. However, in the current political climate, certain operational details might be misinterpreted by hostile media. Richard activated the call recording feature on his secure phone. Senator, are you suggesting that the authorized elimination of a Russian intelligence asset might somehow be politically damaging? I'm suggesting that context matters, Mr. Marquez. Viktor Petrov wasn't just a Russian agent. He was a British double agent feeding information to both MI6 and the CIA. When you killed him, you eliminated a valuable allied asset to protect your own network. Richard's blood went cold. That detail had been omitted from his briefing files 15 years ago. You're saying I killed a British agent? I'm saying you killed someone who was providing critical intelligence to our allies. The British government has never been informed of the circumstances of Petrov's death. If that information became public during a presidential campaign, it would destroy any candidate who authorized the operation. Precisely. Which is why it's in everyone's interest for certain operational details to remain classified. Richard made his decision. Senator, I've maintained operational security for 15 years. My family and I simply want to live quietly. I'm glad you understand. Unfortunately, others involved in that operation have proven less discreet. David Park was considering writing a book about his intelligence experiences. Michael Torres had begun speaking with a journalist about untold stories from the Moscow station. So you had them killed. The line was quiet for several seconds. Mr. Marquez, sometimes difficult decisions must be made to protect national interests. I'm sure you understand. What I understand, Senator, is that you're eliminating American citizens to protect your political career. I'm eliminating security risks to protect American foreign policy relationships. The British alliance is worth more than individual lives. Richard felt rage building in his chest, but kept his voice level. And my family? Were they considered acceptable casualties? Your family would have been collateral damage in a criminal incident involving organized crime. Salvador Black's nephew really did harass your daughter. We simply arranged for the situation to escalate beyond your ability to control it. You used my daughter as bait. We used existing circumstances to provide operational cover. It's regrettable, but necessary. Richard's vision went red. Everything, the harassment, the threats, the home invasion, had been orchestrated to provide cover for his assassination. His daughter's fear, his wife's terror, his family's violation, all calculated moves in a political chess game. Senator, you made a critical error in judgment. And what's that, Mr. Marquez? You assumed I was still the same man who followed orders without question in Moscow. But that man died the day I retired. The man you're dealing with now only follows one rule: protect his family at any cost. Mr. Marquez, I hope you're not making a threat against a United States senator. I'm making a promise, Senator. You involved my daughter in your cleanup operation. That was a line you should never have crossed. Richard hung up and immediately called Tom Murphy. Tom, did you get all that? Every word, and it's being transmitted to a federal judge as we speak. Richard, we've got enough to bring down Cruz and his entire operation. No, we don't, Richard said quietly. We have a recording that will be dismissed as fabricated, evidence that can be challenged in court, and witnesses who are either dead or discredited. Cruz has had months to prepare for this contingency. So what do we do? Richard smiled, and Tom Murphy felt a chill at the expression. We remind Senator Cruz why the Moscow shadow never left loose ends. Richard, whatever you're thinking. Tom, Cruz used my daughter as operational cover to justify murdering me. He orchestrated an attack on my family to protect his political ambitions. The federal justice system moves too slowly, and he has too many resources and connections. You can't just assassinate a presidential candidate. I'm not going to assassinate anyone, Richard said calmly. I'm going to expose him so thoroughly that the truth becomes undeniable. By the time I'm finished, Howard Cruz will beg for the mercy of federal prison. Richard was already moving, his operational mind calculating vectors of attack that would dismantle Cruz's entire conspiracy. The Moscow shadow had been awakened for the second time in a week. And this time, the target was a man who thought himself untouchable. Senator Howard Cruz was about to learn that some enemies couldn't be eliminated with money and political influence. Some enemies fought back, and some enemies never forgot that their daughter had been used as bait in a killing game. Chapter 8: The Moscow Shadows Return. Richard spent the next 18 hours activating every asset, contact, and favor he'd accumulated during 25 years in intelligence work. By dawn, a web of surveillance, investigation, and covert action was focusing on Senator Howard Cruz and his presidential campaign with surgical precision. His first call was to Elena Vasquez in her Brooklyn safe house. Elena, I need complete electronic surveillance on Senator Howard Cruz. Phones, computers, campaign offices, personal residences. Everything. Jesus, Richard, a sitting senator and presidential candidate. That's treasonous levels of surveillance. Elena, remember the Petrov operation in Moscow? Someone's been killing everyone with operational knowledge to protect Cruz's campaign. David Park and Michael Torres are already dead. I'm next on the list, and they used my daughter as operational cover. They used Caroline? Those bastards. Elena's voice turned ice cold. Richard, for that, I'd hack the Pentagon itself. Give me 12 hours. His second call was to Dmitry Volkov in Brighton Beach. Dmitry, I need you to activate every contact in the Russian intelligence community. Tell them the Moscow shadow has information about American operations that would be extremely valuable to Moscow. Richard, this is a very dangerous game you play. Not a game, Dmitry. Cruz authorized the killing of a British double agent and blamed it on me. If the Russians leak that information to the right journalists, it destroys his campaign and exposes the truth about Petrov. Now I understand. Is revenge, not treason. For this, I make calls to old friends in Lubyanka Square. His third call was to Sarah Chun, an investigative journalist with the Washington Post who'd won a Pulitzer for exposing CIA operations. Sarah, I have a story for you. Senator Howard Cruz authorized the assassination of American intelligence personnel to cover up a classified operation gone wrong. Richard Marquez? I thought you'd gone completely dark after retirement. Someone tried to kill my family. Sarah, they used political assassination funds to eliminate witnesses to a botched operation. I have recordings, financial records, and operational details that will end Cruz's presidential ambitions permanently. This is massive, Richard. But I'll need corroboration from multiple sources. You'll have it within 24 hours. By noon, Richard's network was producing results. Elena called with the first breakthrough. Richard, Cruz's campaign manager, is a man named Marvin Palmer. Former CIA, worked in operational planning. He's been coordinating with Luke Robertson through encrypted communications that discuss cleaning up Moscow loose ends. Can you trace the operational funding? Better than that. I can show you bank transfers from Cruz campaign accounts to Blackwater Holdings, then from Blackwater to Robertson's personal accounts. They were stupid enough to use digital transactions. Dmitry called an hour later with even better news. My friends in Moscow are very interested in your story, Richard. They remember Petrov was a valuable asset providing British intelligence on Russian operations. When he disappeared, they assumed British pulled him out. Learning that Americans killed him, this makes them very angry. Angry enough to leak classified information. Angry enough to provide complete Petrov file to international journalists. We'll show he was British agent, not Russian. We'll prove American operation was unauthorized assassination of Allied asset. The final piece came from Sarah Chun that evening. Richard, I've been working my sources all day. Cruz's chief of staff, Alex Boyle, used to work for the FBI task force that protected Salvador Black. When Black's nephew harassed your daughter, Boyle saw an opportunity to create operational cover for your elimination. So the harassment was real, but they escalated it into something that would justify a mob cleanup? Exactly. They manipulated Salvador Black into believing you were a federal threat, then arranged for the Torino family to authorize your elimination. When that failed, they sent in Luke Robertson's team as backup. Sarah, how fast can you publish this story? If you can provide the evidence you promised, I can have it online tonight and in tomorrow's print edition. But Richard, once this goes public, you'll be the most wanted man in America. Cruz will use every resource to discredit or eliminate you. Let him try, Richard said grimly. I've been dealing with people who wanted me dead for most of my adult life. The difference is this time it's personal. That night, as Richard prepared for what would likely be his final operational mission, Julia found him in his study loading equipment into a tactical bag. You're leaving, aren't you? For a few days. I need to finish this before Cruz realizes how much evidence is building against him. Richard, he's a United States senator with unlimited resources. What can one man do against that kind of power? Richard looked at his wife, seeing the fear and love in her eyes. Julia, for 15 years, I've been pretending to be a suburban security consultant. But I was never really that man. I was the Moscow Shadow, and the Moscow Shadow never left a mission unfinished. He kissed her gently, then looked toward Caroline's room. Tell Caroline that everything I'm about to do is to make sure no one ever threatens our family again. Richard left his house at midnight, driving toward Washington, D.C. in a vehicle that couldn't be traced to him. In the passenger seat was a file containing enough evidence to destroy Howard Cruz's political career, expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government, and reveal the truth about operations that had been buried for 15 years. But evidence wasn't enough. Richard had learned in Moscow that sometimes justice required more direct action. Senator Howard Cruz was about to discover that the Moscow Shadow's final mission would be his most personal and most devastating. The game was entering its final phase, and this time, Richard Marquez intended to write the rules himself. Chapter 9. Justice in the Shadows. Howard Cruz's campaign headquarters occupied an entire floor of a Georgetown office building, complete with security systems that would have impressed most intelligence agencies. But Richard Marquez had spent 6 years penetrating buildings that the Russian FSB considered impregnable. At 3:17 a.m., he was inside Cruz's private office, sitting behind the senator's desk when Cruz arrived for his traditional early morning campaign briefing. Good morning, Senator. Richard's voice was calm as Cruz froze in the doorway. We need to finish our conversation. Security, Cruz shouted, but Richard held up a small device. I'm broadcasting on the frequency your security team uses. They're currently hearing a loop of normal corridor sounds. We have privacy. Cruz moved slowly to the chair across from his own desk, studying Richard with the calculating eyes of a career politician. Mr. Marquez, if you kill a United States senator, you'll be hunted for the rest of your life. I'm not here to kill you, Senator. I'm here to give you a choice. Richard placed a tablet on the desk, showing the Washington Post website. The headline read, Presidential Candidate Authorized Assassination of Intelligence Personnel. Sarah Chin's article will go live in 4 hours unless you call her and tell her the story is fabricated, Richard said calmly. The article includes recordings of our phone conversation, financial records tracing campaign funds to assassination contracts, and testimony from Luke Robertson, whose decided cooperation is preferable to federal execution for murdering CIA personnel. Cruz's face went pale as he scanned the article preview. This will destroy American intelligence relationships for decades. No, Senator. This will expose a conspiracy to commit murder for political gain. The intelligence relationships died when you authorized the killing of a British agent and blamed it on operational personnel. You don't understand the larger picture. I understand that you used my 17-year-old daughter as bait in an assassination plot. That's the only picture I care about. Richard leaned forward, his voice dropping to the tone Cruz's security team would never hear. But I'm not here to expose you, Senator. I'm here to offer you the same choice you gave David Park and Michael Torres. Cruz's eyes widened with growing fear. What choice? Withdraw from the presidential race. Announce that health concerns require you to focus on family priorities. Disappear from public life quietly, and Sarah Chin's story never gets published. And if I refuse? Richard smiled, and Cruz finally understood why the Moscow Shadow had been one of the most feared operatives in American intelligence. If you refuse, Senator, then in addition to Sarah's article, the Russian intelligence services will release the complete Petrov file to international media, proving that you authorized the murder of a British agent. The British government will demand extradition for war crimes. Your own party will abandon you to protect themselves. And your family will discover that the man they loved was a monster who murdered American citizens to protect his political ambitions. This is blackmail. No, Senator, this is justice. You had 3 people killed to protect a political career built on authorizing illegal operations. I'm giving you the opportunity to end this quietly. Cruz stared at the article on the tablet, his political mind calculating odds and outcomes. My withdrawal would create chaos in the Republican primary. The party would. The party will survive, Senator. The question is whether you will. Richard's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and smiled. That's confirmation that Luke Robertson has provided complete testimony about your assassination operations to federal prosecutors. Even if you eliminate me right now, the evidence has already been distributed to multiple jurisdictions. What's to stop me from having you killed anyway? Because, Senator, if anything happens to me or my family, there are instructions for the immediate release of everything. Not just to American media, but to Russian intelligence, British MI6, and every journalist who's ever investigated CIA operations. Your name would become synonymous with treason and murder. Howard Cruz sat in silence for 2 full minutes, his political career collapsing in real time as he realized the trap Richard had constructed around him. How do I know you'll honor this agreement? Because, Senator, I'm not like you. When I give my word, it means something. Richard stood to leave, then paused at the door. Oh, and Senator, Drew Black, your nephew's friend who started this entire situation, he's been arrested by FBI agents investigating juvenile sex trafficking. Apparently, his harassment of my daughter was part of a pattern of predatory behavior involving multiple minors. Funny how these things have a way of coming to light when the right people start asking questions. 6 hours later, Senator Howard Cruz announced his withdrawal from the presidential race, citing family health concerns and a desire to focus on his role in the Senate. Sarah Chin's article never ran, replaced by a smaller story about Cruz's surprise withdrawal from national politics. Luke Robertson was found dead in his federal holding cell, an apparent suicide that fooled no one but provided a convenient end to a complicated prosecution. Salvador Black's family relocated to Florida, where their protection and information arrangements were mysteriously terminated, leaving them vulnerable to rivals they'd betrayed during their years as federal informants. Drew Black was transferred to juvenile detention pending trial on multiple charges of sexual harassment and cyberstalking. Richard Marquez returned to Cedar Falls, where he resumed his quiet life as a suburban security consultant and father. The only outward change was the new security system on his house, one that would have impressed most intelligence agencies. 3 months later, Caroline Marquez was accepted to Georgetown University with a full academic scholarship. She never learned that her father's security consulting work had funded the scholarship through a carefully anonymous donation. Julia Marquez never asked her husband about the details of those 3 days when he disappeared to Washington. She'd learned that some questions were better left unasked. But on quiet evenings, when Richard thought no one was watching, Julia would catch him staring at Caroline with an expression of fierce protectiveness that reminded her exactly who she'd married. Not just a suburban father, but a man who would move heaven and earth to protect the people he loved. The Moscow Shadow had completed his final mission, and for the first time in 30 years, Richard Marquez was truly at peace. 1 year later, a small news item appeared in the international section of the New York Times. Former Russian intelligence officer Viktor Petrov, long believed dead, surfaced in London yesterday to provide testimony about Cold War-era intelligence operations to British parliamentary investigators. Richard smiled as he read the article over his morning coffee. Some secrets, it seemed, refused to stay buried. But that was someone else's problem now. The Moscow Shadow was finally, truly retired. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.